Hey guys, in today's video, I bring you an impressive and captivating story. Let's get to know Ophelia Lancaster, a nurse who died for 11 minutes and 32 seconds, and during that time, there was an unbelievable encounter with Jesus Christ. He revealed to him 3 events that will happen before 2030, the Great Deception, the Great Awakening, and the Great Shaking, and sent her back to warn humanity before it's too late. What she saw on the other side will leave you speechless. So before we start, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content like this, and activate the bell to receive all notifications. Now, get ready for this intense and surprising journey. My name is Ophelia Lancaster, and if you're hearing this story, it's because you need to hear it. Before all this happened, I was a practical, scientific woman, head nurse at one of Portland's largest hospitals. I dealt with life and death every day, but I never thought that one day I would cross the border between the two worlds myself. In the early morning of October 12, 2023, I went for a run like I did every morning. I didn't like gyms, the hustle and bustle of the streets during business hours, or the hustle and bustle of people around me. The city was still asleep, and it gave me a strange sense of control. But that night something was different. I tried to ignore the uneasiness that had been building in my chest since I woke up. Something inside me whispered that I should stay in bed, but I ignored it. I put on my sweater, tied my sneakers, and went out into the street. The air was cold and damp, and fog shrouded the sidewalks, making the scene even quieter. I passed through Post Sinclair, which was always closed at this time, and I continued on my way, hearing only the sound of the soles of my shoes hitting the wet asphalt. One step, other, controlled breathing, total concentration. But then, a strange weight came over me. My breathing became shorter. My shoulders stiffened. I had felt this before. It was the same feeling I had when I was in the hospital and felt that a patient was about to die, even without a rational explanation. A premonition? No, I didn't believe in those things. I started to hesitate. I could turn around. But then I looked at the clock, 4:47, and it was at that exact moment that I saw the headlights. It was as if time had slowed down. The glow invaded my eyes, illuminating every droplet of moisture in the air, the roar of the engine, the sound of tires skidding on wet asphalt, and then, impact. There was no time to scream. My body was thrown into the air like a rag doll. The shock was overwhelming, but it only lasted an instant. My skull hit the asphalt, and my vision went blurry. I knew at that moment that I was dying. So everything was dark. There was no pain, no sharp shock or choking sensation, just an instant of consciousness that disappeared as quickly as it arrived. What did I expect? Nothing. The end. The void. As a nurse, I had seen many patients taking their last breath, and that was it. The heart stopped, the body grew cold, and silence took over. No light tunnel, no life after death, but I was wrong, because I was still there. I don't know exactly when I realized something was happening. In the instant following the impact, I felt that I was no longer on the cold, wet asphalt. There was no sound of sirens. There was no cold wind against my skin. There was no weight of my body against the ground. Instead, an impossible lightness took care of me, as if I were floating. My vision got blurry, but not in a normal way. It was as if everything around me was dissolving into a soft blur of colors and brightness. And then, the light came. One intense luminosity, gold and white, invaded everything, but it didn't hurt my eyes. On the contrary, this light enveloped me in a comforting way, like a warm blanket on a cold day. And there, within that light, I felt really alive, more than I had felt at any time in my existence. All the worries, all the anxieties of everyday life, everything disappeared. There was no more work, no more bills to pay, no more accumulated emails. There was only one absolute silence, but at the same time it was full, filled with something I couldn't explain. I tried to move. There was no weight. There was no effort. My body, if I still had one, seemed to be made of pure essence, a light, but real presence. It was at that moment that I understood. I was dead. But contrary to what I imagined, it didn't make me afraid. There was no despair. There was no panic. Just an absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. And suddenly, I saw someone. A figure appeared in the distance, walking towards me. The air around her seemed to vibrate, as if it carried a power I couldn't understand. My heart, if I still had one, recognized before my mind. My grandmother. Time didn't exist there, at least, not the way I knew him. Everything seemed suspended in an eternal moment, as if I were floating inside a dream more real than reality itself. The light around me was not just light. It pulsated, it vibrated gently, as if it had a life of its own, and I could feel it. There was neither cold nor heat, just a perfect temperature that enveloped my skin. If I still had skin, I was completely awake, but my perception was expanded in an impossible way. That's when I noticed the approaching silhouette. At first, it was just an outline within that golden and white light, but as she got closer, I recognized every detail. My grandmother. She passed away when I was 12. He was the only person in my family who always tried to teach me about faith, about God, about the existence of something beyond this life. I never believed it. I always thought they were just comforting words to ease the fear of death. But now, she was there, and she looked different, younger, more vibrant, as if he were in his 30s. His face still had the features I knew, but it was brighter, more vivo. Her skin radiated something I couldn't describe in words. She looked at me with a love so pure and deep that I felt my knees give way. I wanted to run to her, hug her, tell her how much I missed her, but before I could speak, I heard his voice. "Don't be afraid." Her voice wasn't what I remembered. There was something more, one presence, a vibration that seemed to connect directly with my soul. But at the same time, I understood your words before they were even spoken. There, in that reality, there was no need for explanations. My grandmother reached out to me. His touch wasn't solid, but it was real, as if we were connected by something beyond the physical. "He's waiting for you." The moment she said that, the environment has changed. The light around began to concentrate. The colors intensified. Something, or someone, was approaching. And then, I knew I was about to meet the one who created everything. The light around me began to intensify, not like an explosion, but like it was focusing on a single point, becoming denser, more present. The feeling of absolute peace was still there, but something else was brewing in the air, an indescribable power. I couldn't see who was approaching, but my spirit already knew. It was as if every part of me, mind, body, soul, recognized the presence before my vision even understood it. It was him. My grandmother took a step back, as if she was letting me go it alone. I didn't need words to understand that I was about to stand before the Creator himself. The light began to take shape. At first, it looked like an indistinct silhouette, but then it became clear, a radiant, indescribable figure, Jesus Christ. It wasn't like the paintings I had seen as a child. He was not a pale man with long hair and a delicate beard. It was something much bigger. He didn't need to speak for me to feel the truth of his presence. His essence overflowed with power and love in overwhelming proportions. The moment my eyes met his, I fell to my knees. It wasn't something conscious. My spiritual body simply couldn't bear to be in front of so much glory. Jesus' eyes were like oceans of living light. It wasn't just a look. It was absolute knowledge, which crossed me and revealed everything I was. Every thought, every mistake, every moment of my life was open before him. I couldn't hide anything. For a moment, I was afraid. Would he judge me? Would he see my unbelief, my failures, my arrogance in denying his existence for so long? But then, I felt something I had never felt before. He knew everything about me, and yet he loved me. The love that emanated from him was so overwhelming that made me cry. They were not tears of sadness, but of complete surrender, a deep relief in knowing that, despite everything, I was accepted. I didn't need to ask anything. He already knew my doubts. His voice finally echoed, but it was not like an ordinary voice. It was as if every word it was creation. It was pure truth manifesting itself in reality. And he said, "Time is short." It was then that the visions began. As soon as Jesus spoke those words, the environment around me has transformed. The warm golden light disappeared, and I was enveloped by a vast black void. For a brief moment, I felt an overwhelming loneliness, as if I had been ripped away from the divine presence. But before fear took me over, the scenery began to form before me. I saw the earth, not like a planet far away in space, but like he was hovering above her, seeing everything from above. Crowds of people were gathered around the world, looking up at the sky in fascination and awe. And then, it happened, as lights appeared in the skies. At first, they were just bright spots, twinkling like stars. But then, they began to move in a coordinated manner, forming complex geometric patterns. The night sky was filled with shapes and colors never seen before, and the crowds below began to fall to their knees. A feeling of ecstasy took over the world. People cried, raised their hands, loved it. And then, the beings appeared. They came down from the sky, floating gently, and they were beautiful, so beautiful that it was difficult to look away. Tall, with glowing skin, wearing ethereal robes that seemed to be made of liquid light. Their faces were serene, and each of them exuded an artificial and mesmerizing peace. When they spoke, their voices were not heard by the ears, but within each person's mind. It was as if his thoughts were imprinted directly into human consciousness. They talked about love, peace, evolution, and unity. They said they came to guide humanity into a new time of enlightenment, and the whole world heard them, but something was wrong. At first they mentioned Jesus, but not as the Son of God. They said that he was a great teacher, one guide among many, and that his mission on earth had been misinterpreted. The cross was a mistake, they said. The sacrifice was unnecessary. True ascension comes from within, from the knowledge and awakening of the divine in each one. I could see people's reactions. Many accepted immediately. Religious leaders began to reformulate their beliefs. Churches were transformed into temples for this new truth. The beings demonstrated incredible powers. They cured the sick instantly, levitated, and materialized objects out of thin air. But Jesus beside me looked at me seriously and said, "Even the elected can be deceived." At that moment, I understood the lie. These beings were not here to save. They were here to replace truth with falsehood. I saw pastors embracing this new faith. I saw Christians being convinced that they were wrong from the beginning. I even saw people who once knew the Word of God being carried away by this seduction. And then, everything went dark. The vision ended, and I was back at Jesus' side. My soul trembled. He looked at me and said, "The great deception is coming. You need to warn them." Jesus. Words still echoed inside me when the environment around us has changed again. The darkness that had consumed everything in the previous vision dissipated, and suddenly, I was in front of a different world. There was fire, but not a destructive fire. It was a fire that didn't burn, but illuminated. It hung in the air, spread through the streets, penetrated people's hearts. It was a fire of revival. We men and women falling to their knees, crying in despair, confessing his sins with overwhelming conviction. We young people being taken by a supernatural presence and raising their hands to the heavens, calling out the name of Jesus in the streets, schools, and squares. And then, the demonstrations began. Real miracles were happening. Blind people saw. People who have been confined to wheelchairs all their lives, they got up and walked. Addicts were freed at the same instant, as if an invisible weight was lifted from their souls. They were doctors, scientists, teachers, businessmen, artists, politicians, not just people who already believed, but also those, like me, who previously denied the existence of God. It was an impossible movement to contain. Conventional churches, they couldn't handle all these people. Then the revival began to grow up inside houses, on the streets, in the fields. The Holy Spirit was being spilled in a way like never before. But then, I saw the other side of the coin. The hatred growing against this movement. Politicians and leaders of the world called the revival dangerous, radical, fanatical. We Christians being persecuted in ways that had never happened before. We parents kicking their children out of the house for not accepting this faith. We teachers being fired for teaching about Christ. We pastors being publicly ridiculed, censored, arrested. The society started hunting them. The media called them crazy, extremists, a danger to the New World Order. Even so, they didn't give up. I saw young men being whipped, but their eyes shone in a way I couldn't understand. Saw men and women walking to their deaths, but smiling, because they knew that death had no power over them. Jesus looked at me and said, "This will be the greatest revival in history, but also the cruelest persecution that has ever existed." My heart sank. The truth would not be accepted easily. And then, the vision faded. I knew what was coming next. The purification, the shake. As soon as the vision of the Great Awakening disappeared, the world around me went dark again. This time, the transition was different. The air became heavy, thick, as if something invisible was pressing against my chest. Jesus remained by my side, but his expression was serious, solemn. Suddenly I saw the earth shaking. It wasn't just a physical earthquake. It was a spiritual and moral shock. The nations were in chaos. The cities were in ruins. Protests, explosions, mass panic. People were running around aimlessly, some screaming for help, others just watching as everything fell apart. And then, the collapse came. Economies failed at once. The governments lost control. The world has entered a crisis unprecedented. But the worst part, it was not the collapse of human systems. It was the collapse of faith. Jesus pointed to me and, without needing words, I understood. The big shake. It wasn't just an event. It was a filter. It was a testing time. The moment when everything that was not rooted in him would be uprooted. I saw 3 groups forming. The first group were the hardened. They rebelled against God. If God exists, why would he allow this? They shouted. They rejected the truth even more than before. Their minds and hearts were completely closed. They blasphemed the name of God. They chose to follow the deception. The second group were the weak in faith. They were those who they believed in God, but they had never rooted their faith in him. And in the face of suffering, they gave up. I saw people tearing up their Bibles, renouncing God, seeking security in governments, in new doctrines, in the world system. Some they sold their faith for a plate of food. But then I saw the third group, you faithful. They were few, but his eyes shone like fire. They were not afraid. They did not deny Christ even when everything was taken from them. They no longer had houses. They had no assets, but they had the presence. And then, I saw something that made me tremble. We angels walking among them. We miracles happening where no one believed there was still hope. We people multiplying food, praying amidst the ruins and being heard, surviving things that no one could explain. The world despised them, but they were protected in a way no one could understand. Jesus looked at me. This isn't a punishment. It's a purification. His words, they cut my soul like a sword. The great shake would not be the end. It would be separation, the final split. And then, everything disappeared. I felt my spirit being pulled. The time of my journey was running out. I needed to go back. The spiritual world began to dissolve around me. The light that surrounded me retracted. The colors began to fade, and the overwhelming peace I felt began to be replaced by something denser and heavier. I didn't want to go back. Everything inside me resisted. I knew what awaited me on the other side. Pain, disbelief, rejection. I had just been in the presence of Christ himself. I had just received truths that would shake humanity. And now, should I return to the physical world and continue as if nothing had happened? No, I wanted stay there. I wanted remain in the light, in that peace, in that absolute certainty that everything made sense. But then, I heard his voice one last time. Now go back and warn them. And before I could respond, before I could plead to stay, I was ripped away from there. It was an indescribable shock. The perfect peace exploded into 1,000 pieces and gave way to something brutal and harsh. Pain. Overwhelming pain. I was thrown back into my body like someone being pulled out of a deep dream and forced to face a cruel reality. My lungs burned as they tried to function again. My heart raced in an uncontrolled frenzy. Every cell of my being screamed against that return, as if my very existence was being forcibly stitched back together. Then, the sound of machines took over my senses. The cold light of the ICU flickered above me. There were noises, alarms, voices, rushing footsteps. The smell of antiseptic and metal filled my nostrils. And then, a voice shouted, "She's back!" I heard frantic movement around me. I felt needles, tubes connected to my body, something pressing on my chest. My heart was beating again. My eyes slowly opened, and the first thing I saw was the white, impersonal ceiling of the hospital. My vision was blurred, and my head was throbbing. The pain was unbearable, but worse than the physical pain was the feeling of being displaced. I didn't belong there anymore. I was back in the world, but it was no longer the same. Tears ran down my face, not because I was alive, but why I knew my mission was just beginning. The pain, the weight, the body trapped in a reality that no longer seemed mine. I was back. Little by little, I became aware of where I was. The intensive care unit at Providence St. Vincent Medical Center, the same hospital where I worked. But now I was the patient. The room was full of doctors and nurses. I recognized some of the faces, but the looks they gave me were a mix of surprise and caution. They had left me for dead. For 11 minutes and 32 seconds, I didn't exist. I saw Dr. Adrian Voss, one of the hospital's surgeons and a close friend. His face was pale. He was holding a chart with my information, but his eyes were fixed on me, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ophelia. His voice was shaking. That wasn't supposed to be possible. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My head throbbed. My soul was still trapped between the two worlds. But there was an absolute certainty within me. I needed to tell what I had seen. It wasn't an option. It was a calling. The following days were a nightmare. The medical team treated me like an inexplicable phenomenon. My exams were all normal. There was no brain injury, no sequelae. This was impossible for someone who had been clinically dead for so long. I should be dead or, at the very least, irreversibly damaged. But I was alive, full, and I knew why. But no one wanted to listen. When I finally managed to speak, I tried to share my experience. At first, Adrian listened patiently, trying to maintain a neutral expression. But as I described the light, my grandmother, the encounter with Jesus, the visions of the future, I saw his expression change. The skepticism in his eyes was evident. He frowned and let out a heavy sigh. Ophelia, your brain has undergone intense trauma. Clinical deaths can cause hallucinations. You know this better than anyone. I laughed, but it wasn't a humorous laugh. I've seen things that are yet to happen, Adrian. He rubbed his temples, trying to come up with a rational answer. What you saw was just a delusion of your mind fighting to survive. There are studies on this. Near-death experiences always involve feelings of peace, reunions with loved ones, intense light. But he didn't know. He didn't know what I had seen. We the great deception. We the great awakening. We the great shaking. And I knew that if I didn't warn people, many would be swallowed by darkness. My mother was the only one who believed in me. When she entered the room, her eyes were filled with tears. She took my hand, and he didn't need me to say anything. You saw him, didn't you? Emotion overflowed inside me. I just shook my head. She smiled, but her eyes were full of fear. That means time is running out. She believed. She knew, but the outside world doesn't. And I was about to find out the price of carrying this truth. The following days were a trial by fire. I knew my life would never be the same again. I had been sent back with a mission, but no one wanted to listen. My co-workers, people with whom I had spent years on duty at the hospital, began to avoid me. Some, like Dr. Adrian Voss, tried to be rational, attributing my experience to brain hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen. Others, they didn't bother to hide their suspicious looks. But it didn't matter. I knew what I had seen, and more than that, I knew what was coming. The big deception would take over the world. The beings of light would come, and millions would believe in them. Many Christians would be deceived, and even religious leaders would rewrite their doctrines to accommodate this new revelation. The Great Awakening would happen soon after. People everywhere would have real encounters with Christ. The Holy Spirit would descend on homes, universities, streets. Miracles would transform lives, but the persecution would be cruel. Whoever followed the truth would pay a price. And then, the big shake, the collapse, the final test, the world would be divided, and each person's faith would be tested in fire. And I was alone with this knowledge. My mother believed in me, but she already knew these things. She always had faith, but what about those who were lost? Those who would be deceived, who weren't ready? It was for them that I came back. I left the hospital weeks later. The world seemed the same, but I was no longer the same. My house was as I had left it. The streets of Portland continued with the same gray routine, but inside me, something burned. There was an urgency, a flame that could not be put out. That night, I knelt beside my bed and closed my eyes. For the first time in my life, I prayed not out of despair, but for direction, and I felt his voice in my heart. Speak, don't be afraid. I will be with you. I took a deep breath. I knew what that meant. I would be ridiculed. I would lose friends. Maybe he faced dangers he didn't even understand yet. But it didn't matter. Why time was running out, and I was sent back to warn them, before it's too late. If you like this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.